In the secluded village of Raventon, nestled deep within the dense woods, there stood an old decrepit mansion at the edge of the forest. Its ancient stones seemed to absorb the darkness, casting a shadow over the surrounding trees. The mansion, known locally as Hawthorne Manor, had a reputation for being haunted, its halls echoing with the whispers of the past. Margaret, a young journalist with an insatiable curiosity, arrived in Raventon on a dreary autumn afternoon. The villagers watched her with wary eyes as she made her way through the narrow streets, her camera bag slung over her shoulder and a determined look in her eyes. She had heard the rumors about Hawthorne Manor, and she was determined to uncover the truth. As Margaret approached the mansion, she couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay, and the sound of rustling leaves filled her ears. She paused for a moment at the wrought iron gate, taking in the sight of the mansion looming before her. With a deep breath, Margaret pushed open the gate and stepped onto the overgrown path that led to the front door. The mansion seemed to creak and groan as if protesting her intrusion, but Margaret pressed on, her heart pounding in her chest. Inside the mansion was a labyrinth of forgotten rooms and shadowy corridors. Margaret moved cautiously through the dimly lit halls, her footsteps echoing eerily against the walls. The air was thick with dust, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling like delicate lace. With each step, Margaret felt the weight of the mansion's history pressing down on her. She could almost hear the whispers of the past echoing through the halls, calling out to her from the darkness. As she explored the mansion, Margaret came across a series of faded portraits lining the walls. They depicted a family she assumed to be the Hawthornes, their faces solemn and austere. She studied the portraits, feeling as though the eyes of the long-dead family were following her every move. Suddenly, Margaret heard a soft sound coming from one of the nearby rooms. It was like the faint strains of music, barely audible above the creaking of the floorboards. Intrigued, she followed the sound, her footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The music led her to a grand ballroom, its once beautiful furnishings now covered in dust and decay. In the center of the room stood an old piano, its keys yellowed with age. Margaret approached cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. As she reached out to touch the piano, the music stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she turned to leave, but before she could take a step, she heard a voice behind her. "Who are you?" the voice whispered, sending shivers down Margaret's spine. She spun around to find herself face to face with a young girl, her eyes wide with fear. "I'm Margaret," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm here to learn about the mansion." The girl regarded her with a mixture of curiosity and sadness. "You shouldn't be here," she said quietly. "This place is dangerous." Before Margaret could respond, the girl vanished into thin air, leaving her alone in the empty ballroom. Margaret stood frozen in place, her mind reeling with confusion. As she made her way back through the mansion, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She hurried through the darkened corridors, her footsteps echoing against the stone walls. Suddenly, she heard a loud crash coming from somewhere nearby. Startled, she froze in place, listening intently. After a moment, she cautiously continued on her way, her heart pounding in her chest. As she rounded a corner, Margaret came face to face with a figure standing in the shadows. She gasped in fright, her pulse racing as she tried to make out the figure's features. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice trembling with fear. The figure stepped forward into the dim light, revealing itself to be an elderly man with a wild look in his eyes. He regarded Margaret with suspicion, his gaze flickering over her. "I am Mr. Jenkins," he said gruffly. "And what are you doing here, young lady?" Margaret swallowed nervously, her mouth suddenly dry. I'm a journalist," she stammered. "I'm here to investigate the mansion." Mr. Jenkins narrowed his eyes at her, his expression unreadable. "You shouldn't be here," he said finally. "This place is cursed." Margaret's heart sank at his words, but she refused to be deterred. She'd come too far to turn back now. Ignoring Mr. Jenkins' warnings, Margaret continued her exploration of the mansion. She searched every room, every corridor, in search of answers. But the deeper she delved, the more questions arose. Finally, as the sun began to set on the horizon, Margaret stumbled upon a hidden staircase concealed behind a tapestry. With a sense of excitement mingled with trepidation, she descended into the darkness below. What she found there would haunt her for the rest of her days. The basement was like something out of a nightmare. The walls were lined with shelves filled with jars containing strange, unidentifiable substances. Symbols were carved into the stone floor, their meanings lost to time. But the most terrifying thing of all was the altar at the center of the room. It was stained with blood, and on it lay the remains of what looked like a small animal. Margaret recoiled in horror, bile rising in her throat. She stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest. Suddenly, she heard a noise behind her. She turned to see a figure emerging from the shadows, its eyes glowing with malice. With a cry of terror, Margaret turned and ran, her footsteps echoing through the empty corridors. She raced up the stairs, the sound of her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. As she reached the top of the stairs, Margaret saw that the entrance to the mansion had been sealed shut, trapping her inside with whatever lurked in the darkness below. With a sinking feeling in her stomach, Margaret realized that she was not alone in the mansion, and that the horrors she had uncovered were far from over. For hours, she wandered the labyrinthine corridors of the mansion, searching for a way out. But no matter which direction she turned, she found herself met with nothing but darkness and despair. Just when she thought all hope was lost, Margaret stumbled upon a hidden passage concealed behind a crumbling wall. With renewed determination, she squeezed through the narrow opening and found herself in a hidden chamber deep within the mansion. The chamber was filled with ancient artifacts and strange symbols, hinting at the mansion's dark past. But as Margaret explored further, she discovered something even more chilling, a series of journals detailing the Hawthorne family's descent into madness and despair. As she read through the journals, Margaret pieced together the tragic story of the Hawthorne family and the dark forces that had consumed them. She learned of their experiments with dark magic and their attempts to summon otherworldly entities from beyond the grave. But as she delved deeper into the journals, Margaret felt a sense of unease wash over her. It was as if the very walls of the mansion were closing in around her, suffocating her with their malevolent presence. Just then, Margaret heard a noise behind her. She spun around, her heart racing, but there was nothing there. She told herself it was just her imagination, but the feeling of being watched lingered. With a trembling hand, Margaret turned the page of the journal, her eyes scanning the faded text. The more she read, the more she became convinced that there was something truly evil lurking within the mansion. Suddenly, she heard footsteps echoing through the corridor outside the chamber. Margaret froze, her breath catching in her throat. She strained her ears, listening intently for any sign of danger. The footsteps grew louder, drawing closer and closer. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest as she braced herself for whatever horror awaited her. But to her surprise, the footsteps passed by the entrance to the chamber without stopping. Margaret let out a shaky breath, her muscles relaxing as the tension drained from her body. She knew she couldn't stay in the chamber forever. With a determined look in her eyes, Margaret gathered up the journals and tucked them into her bag. She knew she had to get out of the mansion and bring the truth to light, no matter the cost. As she made her way back through the darkened corridors, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed. She glanced over her shoulder, but there was nothing there. With each step, the feeling of unease grew stronger. Margaret quickened her pace, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to find a way out of the mansion before it was too late. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Margaret reached the entrance hall. She paused for a moment, listening for any sign of danger. When she heard nothing but the sound of her own breathing, she pushed open the door and stepped out into the cool night air. But as she made her way across the overgrown lawn, Margaret heard a low, guttural growl behind her. She spun around, her eyes widening in terror as she came face to face with a hulking figure emerging from the shadows. It was like something out of a nightmare, a twisted, grotesque creature with glowing red eyes and razor-sharp claws. Margaret's blood ran cold as she realized what she was up against. With a scream, she turned and ran, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear the creature's footsteps echoing behind her, growing closer and closer with each passing moment. But Margaret refused to give up without a fight. With every ounce of strength she had left, she pushed herself harder, running faster than she ever thought possible. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Margaret burst through the trees and stumbled out onto the road. She collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, her heart still racing in her chest. But even as she lay there, panting and exhausted, Margaret knew that her ordeal was far from over. The horrors she had witnessed in Hawthorne Manor would haunt her for the rest of her days. But she was determined to bring the truth to light, no matter the cost. And as she lay there in the darkness, she vowed to never stop fighting until justice was served and the evil that lurked within the mansion's walls was vanquished once and for all. And with that resolve burning bright in her heart, Margaret closed her eyes and let the darkness engulf her, knowing that her journey was only just beginning. As Margaret lay there in the darkness, catching her breath, she knew she couldn't stay still for long. The events of the night had shaken her to her core, but she refused to let fear paralyze her. With a determined grit, she pushed herself up from the ground and glanced back at Hawthorne Manor, its silhouette looming ominously against the night sky. Though exhausted and battered, Margaret's resolve burned brighter than ever. She knew she had to return to the village, to gather her strength, to find allies, and to uncover the truth that lay buried within the mansion's haunted halls. With a steely determination, Margaret set off down the winding road that led back to Raventon. The night air was thick with an eerie silence, broken only by the rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. The darkness seemed to press in around her, but Margaret forged ahead, her footsteps echoing in the stillness of the night. As she walked, Margaret's mind raced with questions. What dark secrets lay hidden within Hawthorne Manor? What was the connection between the Hawthorne family and the malevolent forces that haunted the mansion? And most importantly, how could she put an end to the evil that lurked within its walls? With each step, Margaret grew more determined to find the answers. She knew she couldn't do it alone, but she also knew she couldn't trust just anyone. The villagers of Raventon seemed to harbor their own secrets, and Margaret knew she had to tread carefully if she hoped to uncover the truth. Finally, after what felt like hours of walking, Margaret reached the outskirts of the village. The first light of dawn was beginning to break on the horizon, casting a soft golden glow over the sleepy streets. As she made her way through the quiet village, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The villagers went about their business with wary glances in her direction, and Margaret couldn't help but wonder what secrets they were hiding. Determined to find allies in her quest for the truth, Margaret made her way to the local inn. The building was old and weathered, but a warm light spilled from the windows, inviting her inside. As she stepped through the door, Margaret was greeted by the comforting smell of wood smoke and ale. The innkeeper, a stout woman with a kind face, looked up from behind the bar and smiled. "Good morning, traveler," she said, her voice warm and welcoming. "What can I do for you on this fine day?" Margaret returned the woman's smile, her mind racing with possibilities. She knew she needed allies if she hoped to uncover the truth about Hawthorne Manor, and she had a feeling she might find them here. "I'm looking for information," Margaret said, her voice steady. "About Hawthorne Manor?" The innkeeper's smile faltered, and she glanced around nervously, as if afraid of being overheard. "Hawthorne Manor, you say?" she said, her voice hushed. "What business do you have with that cursed place?" Margaret leaned in closer, her eyes locked with the innkeeper's. "I intend to uncover the truth," she said firmly, "and I could use all the help I can get." The innkeeper studied her for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then with a nod, she reached beneath the bar and pulled out a dusty old book. "This might be of interest to you," she said, sliding the book across the bar. "It's an old journal, written by one of the Hawthorne family's servants. It might shed some light on the mysteries surrounding the mansion." Margaret's heart skipped a beat as she reached for the book. Could this be the breakthrough she had been searching for? With trembling hands, she opened the journal and began to read, her eyes devouring the words on the yellowed pages. For the first time since she had set foot in Raventon, Margaret felt like she was getting closer to uncovering the truth about Hawthorne Manor, and she knew that with the help of the villagers, she might just stand a chance of putting an end to the evil that lurked within its walls. With renewed determination, Margaret closed the journal and looked up at the innkeeper, a steely resolve in her eyes. "I won't rest until I uncover the truth," she said firmly, "no matter what it takes." The innkeeper nodded in agreement, a determined glint in her eye. "Then you'll have the support of the village," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. "We'll help you in any way we can." And with that promise ringing in her ears, Margaret knew that her journey was far from over. The mysteries of Hawthorne Manor still loomed large, but she was determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Armed with the knowledge she had gained and the support of the villagers, Margaret set off once more towards Hawthorne Manor, her heart filled with hope and determination. As Margaret approached Hawthorne Manor once more, she felt a surge of anticipation mingled with apprehension. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the overgrown lawn. She could feel the weight of centuries of secrets pressing down on her as she stood before the imposing facade of the mansion. With a deep breath, Margaret pushed open the creaking gate and stepped onto the path leading to the front door. Every step felt heavy, laden with the weight of her mission. She knew that whatever lay within the mansion's walls, she had to confront it head-on. Inside, the mansion was cloaked in silence, broken only by the sound of Margaret's footsteps echoing through the empty halls. She moved with purpose, her heart pounding in her chest as she made her way deeper into the heart of the abandoned mansion. With each passing moment, the air grew heavier, thick with the scent of decay and the whispers of the past. Margaret's senses were on high alert, every nerve tingling with anticipation. Finally, she reached the heart of the mansion, the grand ballroom. The room was bathed in a soft, ethereal light, casting long shadows across the dusty floor. Margaret could feel a presence looming in the darkness, watching her every move. Summoning all of her courage, Margaret stepped into the center of the ballroom and raised her voice. "Show yourself," she called out, her voice echoing through the empty space. "I know you're here. I know what you've done." For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the sound of Margaret's ragged breathing. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged, a twisted, grotesque creature with glowing red eyes and razor-sharp claws. Margaret's heart skipped a beat as she stared into the creature's eyes, her pulse pounding in her ears. But she refused to back down. She had come too far to let fear hold her back now. With a steely resolve, Margaret faced the creature head-on, her eyes blazing with determination. "You have no power over me," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. "I know the truth now, and I won't let you harm anyone else." The creature let out a guttural growl, its eyes narrowing in anger. But Margaret stood her ground, her gaze unwavering. Slowly the creature began to fade, its form dissipating like smoke in the wind, and as it vanished into the darkness, Margaret felt a sense of peace wash over her. The mansion was silent once more, its secrets laid bare for all to see, and as Margaret stepped out into the fading light of day, she knew that her mission was complete. Though the horrors of Hawthorne Manor would never be forgotten, they would no longer hold power over the village of Raventon. And as Margaret made her way back through the dense woods, she knew that she had finally brought an end to the darkness that had plagued the mansion for so long. And as she disappeared into the trees, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm golden light over the village below. And though Hawthorne Manor stood silent and empty, its halls forever haunted by the echoes of the past, the people of Raventon could finally rest easy, knowing that justice had been served. And so, with the sun setting on the horizon and a sense of peace settling over the land, Margaret disappeared into the forest, leaving behind the darkness of Hawthorne Manor once and for all. And as she disappeared into the trees, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm golden light over the village below. And though Hawthorne Manor stood silent and empty, its halls forever haunted by the echoes of the past, the people of Raventon could finally rest easy, knowing that justice had been served.